Now I've got to say, when I went through the brief of the SM10 wedges, speaking directly to Titleist, I walked away from that meeting a little bit underwhelmed, almost disappointed in what I was hearing about these particular wedges. They release wedges every 2 years, and I just felt that the tech that's gone into these wedges from previous models is maybe not the improvement that I was expecting to see. However, I have spent a bit of time with these wedges now, and I figured I'd share with you the tech that's gone into them and the positives and negatives that I have personally found. So Titleist and Bob Vokey believe that the art in wedge play is all about 3 key points. Number 1, shot versatility. Number 2, controlling your distance and the trajectory that you see for that particular shot. And as you can see, the result of that shot, my distance control is not particularly good. However, that's not necessarily down to the wedge, that's down to me as a player. And finally, maximum spin that we're getting from these shots. So looking at shot versatility, how do we create those different types of shots from different environments? How do we control our distance? How do we control that trajectory, which is really important with distance control as well? But then how do we maximize the spin? Now, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that spin because not everybody needs maximum spin. They need the spin that's going to work best for the shot that they've got ahead of them. Now, when it comes to shot versatility, I think this is where Vokey throughout the years have been the best. Ultimately, the best wedge company out there when it comes to fittings. Now, I was previously a head professional of a golf club, used to stock wedges, and ultimately I was always looking for the best wedge option to fit the best. And throughout the years, Vokey have been able to achieve that. And they've done that because they've worked with some of the best players in the world and created grinds and bounces on the bottom of their clubs that give those players, the best opportunities of getting up and down from lots of different situations. And what I mean by that is that they go from tournament to tournament in different environments, whether they want to get that shot to come out a lot lower, whether they want to get that ball up in the air, whether they're on links golf courses, whether they're on windy golf courses, whatever it is. Bob Vokey and his team have created the grinds and the bounces that have basically worked the best for those best players and then brought it to market for us to use. But how have they been able to achieve this optimal, should we say? Well, Bob Vokey and his team at Titleist have focused on a strike location between grooves 2 and 5, and I know that might seem of a difficult one to achieve for the average golfer. However, you can see there where I've struck this ball from that chip shot that I've kind of got it, well, sandwiched between location of probably groove 2 and groove 3. Now, this is all to do with how I was fitted in this particular wedge. On this one, I've got a 56-degree F grind, and the idea is that if we get that grind and bounce absolutely perfect for the way I deliver the club, that means that that club won't dig into the ground too much. It won't also bounce off the ground too much. It will just be delivered in the perfect location in order for me to access those groove points. Now, anything that's struck a little bit too high in the face, generally what you're going to find is there's no solid part behind that wedge. Therefore, you're going to see a ball sort of pop up in the air a little bit too much and then ultimately reduce a little bit of spin. And then you're losing control, so that ball's going to generally come up a little bit short, and then anything below that is generally going to catch it a bit thin. So having the right fitting for the sole of the club, the bounce of the club, is really, really important. And when it comes to the offering at the bottom of the club, which I have to stress is probably the most important part when it comes to these wedges, they've delivered 25 different options, whether it's the bounce of the club, the grind of the club, and even the loft of the club. And in this offering for the SM10, they've released one more, which is a 54-degree 8 bounce in the M grind. Now the M grind as a wedge is going to be something that has a little bit of heel relief and a little bit of toe relief, and the idea of this is it's going to enable that player to be able to kind of lift the heel up off the ground, lift the toe up off the ground, and give them that versatility around the greens. You've also got the wedge that I kind of use, which is the 60 degree in an S grind, which is in 10 bounce, and basically the grind of that is going to just get a little bit of what we call back relief here, so it enables me to play a little bit more straighter faced, but I can still open it up in bunkers, and it works really quite nicely for me. And then you get the F grind, which is ultimately a full grind. So the idea of this is that, again, you're going to be playing this with more straight-faced, and you're also going to be playing more fuller shots. So 56-degree wedge into 52s, kind of gap wedges. That's where you're going to start to see the F grind work really well. You're not looking to open that club face up too much. You're just trying to play kind of your standard shot. So then we move into progressive CG. I talked about the fact that we're looking for distance and trajectory control. Vokey able to achieve this from this progressive CG, which is not new. This is something that we've seen in certainly coming from SM8 and SM9 and now into the SM10. However, there is a slight change, and that is more towards the gap wedges and wedges in the sets. So when you look at the sand wedges into lob wedges, which I've got here in my hand, a 56-degree wedge, this is going to range from 54 degrees up to 62 degrees. You're going to see a CG location which has been kind of brought further up the club face. The idea of this is you're going to have a slightly thicker kind of top line, because we're talking about things like slip and grip here, and the more you lean a club back, the more that ball is going to want to slip on the first interaction with the face and then start to grip. And if you position that CG just a fraction higher, it should enable us to be able to keep control of that golf ball, keeping it what they call slightly flatter in its flight, which ultimately, again, with the CG in the right spot, is going to give us the spin that we need to keep that control of the golf ball. You're also going to see a slightly different length of hosel. They've been able to move CG around by making that hosel slightly longer or slightly shorter depending on the type of wedge that you've got in your hand and the loft that you've got. Now this hasn't changed from the SM8 days, because ultimately in SM7, and I've gone through the range, I've had SM7, I've had SM8, I've had SM9, and now I'm testing out the SM10 wedges. I've not seen a massive change from SM8 to where we are right now. However, the big shift for me was SM7 into SM8. The feedback that Vokey were getting from their tour professionals was they wanted more of a flatter flight, more controlling that trajectory, whereas in SM7 and probably previous generations, they were getting more of a popping effect off the face, popping up in the air and losing that control of the golf ball. When a player looks up, they want to be able to see the right flight that they're going to get, which is ultimately going to give them the spin and control that they desire. So this is where things, for me, when I talked about the fact that I wasn't overly impressed by the change, but how can you be impressed when actually the way in which they've done it in previous generations, how can they beat that? If they can't beat it, why change it? I actually am seeing a very similar flight than what I saw out of SM8. I'm seeing a very similar flight to what I got in SM9, and I'm seeing almost the identical flight in the SM10. Is that a bad thing? Initially I was a bit down, however now I'm actually really quite happy with it. And when I talked about the shorter hosel lengths for the CG positioning, we're going to see that more in the gap wedges and pitching wedges from Vokey. And that progressive CG moving kind of from that top edge that we talked about more in the lob wedges, now moving into those sand wedges, gap wedges and pitching wedges. And that CG is just going to fractionally get lower and lower in the face. And again, the idea of this is as we take loft off the club, we need that CG position being pushed further and further down the face, again, to optimize the performance. Now this is where things start again to get a little bit confusing for me. Vokey focus on their feedback from their tour professionals, which ultimately is really important. However, talking about CG kind of up and down the face of the club, they've also moved CG in their gap wedges and pitching wedges across the face. They've actually gone more into the toe. Now, the idea of this is tour players prefer to see their ball flight with a wedge kind of fall down to the right, let's say a right-handed golfer, fall down to the right-hand side. It's almost like a little soft fade. with their wedges. They don't like to see a wedge kind of turn over too much. They feel like they lose control, which I fully understand. So what they've done is they've pushed their CG location a little bit closer, and I'm talking millimeters here, but closer to the toe position. The idea of this is to try and keep that face maybe just a little bit more open as it comes into impact, to be able to get that ball flight to just drop softly to the right hand side again for that right-handed golfer. However, the majority of golfers that I've coached throughout my time as a golf coach, they slice the golf ball, they fade the golf ball. So they struggle to get the club face to square up at impact, and a lot of wedge shots that I see from these players is that they get very wafty on it. Now you open up the club face, you're also going to add loft to the club, and therefore you're going to flop it up into the air and then lose that control from that shot, and ultimately lose distance control. So by pushing that CG into that kind of toe area and getting players to get the sense of almost keeping the club face a little bit more open, I'm just a little bit baffled by this. For me, that's a perfect opportunity to put that into a wedge works option, so that can go out as a prototype onto tour. It could even be custom fit for those players that actually do want to see that flight, but to actually put it in your standard wedge that's going to go on the shelf, not sure that's the best solution for all of us golfers out there. And then we move on to maximum spin, which lots of you are going to look at when it comes to the ultimate wedge. How much spin can we get from these particular wedges? Well, Vokey using TX9 precision groove milling. They're saying that it's the gold standard when it comes to the groove cutting process. They're using their painted to spin mill process, which individually cuts based on the loft and the finish of the particular club that you're going to be purchasing. You've also got this micro texture which fits between the grooves. Again, the idea of this is to add that friction and ultimately give us that maximum spin, even with those off-centered strikes. Which, to be fair, we all do get those off-centered strikes, and we still need that wedge to perform perfectly for us. And they do also heat treat right in that spot where we need it the most. So basically where we're going to get the most wear and tear across the face, they'll heat treat it in order to give us a more durability, and ultimately we want our wedges to last as long as possible. Now when it comes to the actual grooves of these wedges, we're going to see, again, just like the CG positioning with those different wedges, so gap wedges and pitching wedges, we're going to put them into two categories. The gap wedge and pitching wedge sitting into one, and then your sand wedge and lob wedge sitting into another. The groove style is slightly different. Now in that sand wedge and lob wedge category, we're getting a groove structure that is a little bit wider and actually a little bit shallower. And then when you move into the gap wedge and pitching wedge category, you're going to see grooves that are going to be slightly narrower and actually slightly deeper. And both of these structures are going to give us what Titleist say, a slightly lower launch, actually 0.5 degrees, and slightly more spin, actually 300 revs on an average more. Now when I say you're going to see the grooves, you're not actually going to see the grooves. They're micro grooves. You're not going to actually see the difference between, let's say, SM8 through to now SM10. However, again, this is where I kind of looked at it and thought, well, it's marginal gains. But if you're starting off with a wedge that's potentially got 300 revs more, as it does wear out, you're still going to have more spin when you move on through its life of the wedge. So actually not necessarily a bad thing. Now a couple of other things that I want to mention when it comes to the new SM10 lineup is the finishes on them. Now having the right finish on a wedge actually I think is really important. Throughout the years you've seen those kind of chrome finish, which we have here, this bottom one giving us that kind of, well, a kind of tour inspired look, but then you get a little bit too much glare possibly on those sunnier days, especially in those lob wedges. So I've used over the years the jet black finish, which again they have released it in this particular lineup. And then you had, in previous wedges, you had the brushed steel. That's now gone, and we've created this new nickel, which actually sits really quite nicely kind of between that chrome and that jet black. So for me personally, I actually really like that nickel, and that's the one that I would 100% go for. The other thing I want to mention is we've got a £10 increase in the retail price of this particular wedge. Now it's going to change wherever you go around the world, and it'll also change from when you're watching this video, because the price will fluctuate from shop to shop, whether you're online or going into your pro shop. But one thing that I've always recommended when it comes to wedges, and actually any clubs, is please get fit for these particular wedges. So important, not necessarily from the spin, but from the bottom of the clubs. Get these clubs to perform the best for you if you're going to spend $169.99 on a new wedge. So am I impressed with the new release of the SM10 Wedges by Vokey? Probably not. And the reason for that is because I feel like Vokey have nailed it when it comes to the actual lofts and grinds and bounce options, and they've been the #1 wedge since 2004, certainly on tour and probably in most people's golf bags around the world. But they've already nailed it from that point of view, and when it comes to then the changes in the SM10 range from previous models of SM8, SM9 and now into this range, I'm not seeing a great deal of difference. I'm also not feeling a great deal of difference. But is that actually a bad thing? Is it just a replacement for those people that have worn out their wedges and maybe want a different colour look down at the ball? I'd like to hear down in the comments what you think about that, and I also want to hear about the offering of that new 5408M grind. Is that an offering that you particularly want to see in this lineup, and how does the price sound to you? For me personally, I really wanted to see maybe a full face option. Throughout the years, I've had wedges, certainly my lob wedge coming out of bunkers, where that wear and tear move across the face and into the toe, and it's how I play bunker shots, and it's how lots of people play their bunker shots. So having that full face option might have actually been maybe a step forward for Vokey when it's come to the SM10 range. But I'd like to hear down in the comments, what do you think of the SM10 range by Vokey and Titleist, and will you be booking yourself in for a fitting with these? If you are new to the channel, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you again on the next video.